Today is
20th.
the 20th of April, 2011, and I'm sitting here with my grandpa, Kinsey Reeves. When were you born, Grandpa?
I am now 86. I was born November 26, 1924, and Kinsey, in view of our earlier conversation, a few things I remember from early youth, I'll just mention to give you a point of reference. When I was about 6 years old, I was the youngest of three boys. We did not own a radio, so in the evening we'd go to the neighbor's house and we'd listen to two programs. One was Kate Smith. She sang When the Moon Comes Over the Mountain. And the other one was the one of Easy. And then that was about it that of that particular time. And some years later, when I was about 10, we moved to a different house in Parkersburg, Iowa, and Dad and Mother bought a radio. And in those days, the early evening hour on the radio was Jack Armstrong, Captain Midnight, and such Little Orphan Annie. And we'd get to listen, we, not my older brothers, but I would get to listen to those after my chores were done and before supper. The period of time when I acknowledge in later years, thinking back on it, during what we call now the Depression. At that time, I did not know it was a depression because everybody in our town was in the same boat. They were helpful to each other. They all planted gardens. The ladies all canned their fruit and vegetables. The fact is that we all just helped each other. The first job that I remember was carrying papers when I was 10 years old. And then the next regular job I had, which was only on Saturdays after I finished carrying papers, where I would candle eggs at the local grocery store. In those days, all of the farmers came to town on Saturday, all of them. And the wives would bring in the eggs, and we would candle the eggs and give them credit for the good eggs. We would return their bad eggs to them and a note as to how many were good, and they would take that out in trade for groceries. All of the farmers were not noble and outstanding because there were some that brought in the same rotten eggs week after week. Anyway, after building the egg cases in the morning, egg crates is the right name, we candled eggs all day, and we would candle about 100 crates of eggs from early morning till we finished that night. And each crate held 15 dozen eggs. So, and for that I got $1 a day. At some point, I figured that everything I was doing was worth more than $1 a day because they were long days and hard work, not just candling eggs, but all the cleanup of the store, what have you. Anyway, I quit my job, and my father was disappointed. He didn't scold. but he expressed his disappointment that I would quit a job that paid me $1 a day. Later on, a friend of mine and myself, in those days, they would have grain elevators that were also lumber yards and coal yards. And they would bring the coal in by train on the regular coal car, and these would be parked on the house track close to where the coal yard bins were. The coal would come in different categories, lump rather, and large blocks. And later years, after I was in high school, we came upon stoker coal, but that was not the case during the Depression. A man and his son would get paid, the father would get paid $3 a day to unload the coal car into the coal bins. That would be 60 tons of coal that you lift up on the edge of the car and then you throw it into the bin that had a trap door at the top. And when you get a bin full, you would take, and with a jack of sorts, you would move the coal car to the next bin. Anyway, so I would help my friend when his father couldn't work. We would each get $1.50 a day for unloading a coal car, and it would take about 3 or 4 days for us young guys to unload a car. But it was a job and income. And then later on, in my mid to late teens, 13 or 14, I guess, I got a job at the local bakery as a baker's helper. And this was essentially a summer job when I wasn't attending school. And it was hard work for a man, let alone a young man, but I had the easier work to do. I had to clean up, you don't wash, but you had to clean all our bread pans so the next day's baking would not have any black spots on the bread. You would also take care of the oven, you would fry the donuts, you would help make the rolls and cookies and things like that. Anyway, I would go to work about 9:30 or 10 at night, and I'd work until about 10 or noon the next day. And I did that 6 days a week. Starting Sunday night, I got Saturday off, and my pay was $5 a week for 10, 12 hours a day. Again, I was glad to have the job. Friends of mine who weren't as fortunate as I, they would send their son down to help, and we would give him and them day-old bread, which they were glad to get, except day-old bread was really 2 days old by then. My dad in those days was one of 3 men in town that had a salary. There were store owners and lawyers and undertakers and gas station owners that had income of sorts, but only 3 men had salaries. Dad was one, he worked for the railroad. Another one was a manager of the Bell Telephone Company there in town. And the third one was the guy in charge of the electric utilities. Dad joined the railroad, I think in 1917, he had gone north from his home in the farmlands in Mississippi. He went north to New York to learn telegraphy, and he went for work for the Illinois Central upon graduation from telegrapher school. And the railroad was one of the only things that in those days offered a pension. The pension is now similar to what we call Social Security, but in those days it was attractive to my father. He always insisted, and not by word of mouth, but by his conduct, that we protect our jobs. It was always important that you protect your work. You never are late or you are never absent, even if you don't maybe feel good, but you protect your job. John went to work for the railroad after his release from World War II in the Army. Tom went to work for the railroad on his release from the Navy at the end of World War II. And I went to work for them for a while, but then, along with John and Tom, I attended college in my off hours. Going back a few years before World War II, in high school, as I say, we didn't really know it was a depression because everyone was in the same boat. But in retrospect, thinking back on it, the depression really ended with the outbreak of Pearl Harbor. That was the first time that local fellas had jobs to go to, and the jobs to go to would be in the service. And when that happened, jobs became a bit more available back in hometown. John, my oldest brother, in 1940, they had a compulsory draft. John was of draft age and he was drafted into the Army in late 1940. December 7 of 41, Pearl Harbor. Tom joined the Navy late in December. And he had already had 2 years of college. I was a senior in high school, and one evening after basketball practice in early February, the superintendent of the school wanted to meet after basketball practice with all ball players. His name was Dory, an older fella, but he talked about World War I. He wasn't in there, but he talked about World War I and the men that answered their call to colors to go fight in World War I and how brave they were, and the condition of our country was necessary that brave men also respond to fight for our flag. We were impressed, but we weren't filled with the flag at that time. But that night, a friend of mine by the name of Claude Harrison, who is a dear friend, we lived about a block apart. We were walking home from basketball practice, and we usually had a lot to talk about. But that particular night, and it was February, it was dark, it was cold, and we only had to walk about 3 blocks to home. We were both quiet, and then he said, "You bastard, I know what you're thinking." And I said, "You bastard too, you're thinking the same thing." He says, "Yeah, well, we'll see what happens." Anyway, That day, or probably the next day, things were changed at home. It was a good home, a kind home, always, and a pleasant home, always. But things had changed because John was gone, and now Tom was in the Navy, and we're at war. So I tell Mom and Dad that I would like to join the Marines. They weren't instantly, they didn't reply, but they said, "Well, give it some thought, son." The next day, apparently, Dad and Mother talked about it, or that night yet. But anyway, they agreed that if this is what I wanted to do, they would permit me to join the Marines. One of the things that I found out years later influenced that was during World War I, Dad worked for the railroad. And there were certain jobs that you would not be permitted to leave to join the service. One of the jobs that was frozen that you couldn't get out of was the job Dad was on in the railroad. And he always felt bad that he could not join his friends in the service. But I think that influenced him a bit to permit me to go. Anyway, I went to the Marines, and I was out there in February, and I got my dungarees and all this and that, my bucket of soap and washboard and clothespins and scrub brush and toothpaste and all that junk. And that bucket cost me $5 and some cents. The pay in those days was $21 a month. I remember the first month we walked down the pay line, there's a guy behind the table and you give him your name, and he looks at the IBM sheet and gives you what is due you. My pay that first week was $15 and some cents. And I walked out, and there's a big, fat gunnery sergeant that asked the guy ahead of me, "You want to buy a war bond, buddy?" "No." "How about a war stamp?" "How much are they?" He said, "Well, we have them for 25 cents and a dime." He said, "No." He said, "Are you sure?" The guy said, "Yes." So he hollered at the guy behind him and says, "Here's a guy for your mess hall next week." So I'm next. "You want to buy a war bond, buddy?" "No." "How about a stamp?" "I'd like to buy a 10-cent stamp." So I gave him a dime, he gave me the stamp, and the stamp exists someplace around here. I have no idea. I've seen it back at 8113 now. Anyway, I didn't go to mess duty. I was out on the parking lot being a sharpshooter. In those days, a sharpshooter was a guy with a bucket and a pole with a nail stuck in the end of it. And you picked up cigarette butts and stuck them, or any little item on the parking lot you had to pick up. That's how you became a sharpshooter. Well, anyway, I was out there one day, and the bus came in, and a bunch of new recruits or new guys joining, and it was, among them was Claude Harrison, my friend from 2 blocks at home, that he and I walked home together that night from basketball practice. Anyway, he and I ended up in the same boot camp, and we served through boot camp and radio and on out for the first couple of years in the Pacific. Anyway, the moments going back now before World War II, when it was still what they now call recession, Dad and mother, well, a couple of things. In those days, many of the trains passenger no, but freight trains carried hobos. And when the hobos would get off the train, they would ask the agent or anyone where might be a good place to get a bite to eat. If they looked decent, Dad would instruct them how to get to our house. And they would come up and knock at the back door, and they would wonder if the lady of the house might have a bite to eat. Mother always knew that Dad pulled that trick, but she would say, yes, I do have, just have a seat. So he would sit on the back porch steps, and she would prepare him something to eat, depending on if it was morning or noon, what have you. But Dad would come home that evening from work, and Ma would always say, Dad, you did it again. So, and also in those days, in this small town of about 1,300, there was a large bridge that spanned a river that ran on the outskirts of town. And the railroad sent in what they called a bridge and building gang. The bridge and building gangs would come, and they would arrive in 3 bunk cars that would be parked on the house siding. The one bunk car would hold all of their equipment. Another bunk car would hold the kitchen and the dining area. And the third bunk car would be the cots and what have you for the bridge and building men. While Dad was from Bogchitto, in the country outside of Bogchitto, and he went to school sitting on a log when the cotton season wasn't ripe. But anyway, Dad, of course, spoke English and learned to type well in his later training, but every evening he would go back down to the depot when the colored men were in town, and they couldn't read nor write. But they would have messages they would want sent to their wives, and they knew the name of the town and the names of their wives. So every evening, Dad would go down to the depot and type letters for these colored men back to their wives, which, in retrospect, told me a lot about my dad. And so that was pretty much the theme of the day when they were helpful to each other. I never knew Dad to curse, never knew him to speak unkindly of anybody. Those are some talents that I don't happen to share in adequate amount, but they were beneficial to the community and to him as a citizen of the community. One of the events that happened during the Depression, our school happened to have the biggest gym in the county. None of the towns in the county had football teams. They would be too expensive, but they all had basketball teams. Most of the basketball courts were in the basement, and so you couldn't make a high shot, but we had a gym. And the county tournament was in our town. And the train number 12, number 11, because it was heading west. The odd number trains head west, and even ones heading east. Number 11 come into town at 11 something that night. It came in on schedule. There had been a heavy snow ever since the ball game started in the afternoon. And it was very heavy. It was knee deep by the time. Of course, I wasn't as tall in as I am now, but by the time I went home, it was knee deep. Anyway, the train could not get started. So you had the passenger train stuck in Parkersburg all night until the snowplow could get to it. Ma would let John make coffee, and he would go down there and he would serve coffee to the passengers for a nickel a cup. And that was big money in those days for him. Anyway, that happened to be one item. There is another item of importance, but not related to my parents or me, but to your grandmother. When she was in preteens, her father had been a truck driver and he broke his back and some other bones. He had to be laid up in a body embracer cast for over a year. And Jessup, Iowa, a little bit smaller than Parkersburg, had the same elements of what we now call depression that all of the other small towns had. Anyway, in those days, Betty's youngest sister was a baby, or an infant certainly, and her mother, to keep the family fed and what have you, not only ran the garden, but she arranged their house so that she could rent out 2 rooms to male renters. Now, how that always worked almost defies our present method of living, because they had 1 bathroom and the girls had to acknowledge the men were renters and they had to go in and get out of there early and all the rest of it. So anyway, that existed for over a year, for as long as her father was laid up, and then he could not work for another year plus when he was on a cane. But all of that happened. So your grandmother went through the difficult times that all of us did, and her mother, a most gracious lady who, not typical of those days, she went to college, became a teacher and a principal. But that was after she took care of her husband and the kids were back sort of on their own. Anyway, all of that leads to a service and return from service and jobs, and that's pretty much the story of the key elements, at least, of the Depression. It really wasn't thought of until we get older and think back on our childhood. So that's about it, Kinsey.
So that was, would you say, from you were born in 1924.
It would be from about from my knowledge, 1934 to 1941.
And that's when you...
That's when I joined the service.
Okay.
I joined in February 42.
Okay.
But a lot of guys of that age joined the service right after Pearl Harbor.
Your parents, they weren't immediately, they didn't they weren't responsive when you told them you wanted to join. Was
Not on the first day, but
Yeah.
they agreed within 1 or 2 days.
Do you think that was because you had your older two brothers? They're already in the service, and they were afraid of having all three, and or maybe that you had different aspirations.
Well, Kinsey, I'm sure that entered their mind, but again, Dad was denied his desire to join the service in World War One, and it's a desire he had all of his life or he felt cheated all of his life because he had been frozen on his job and he could not enter. And I think that was a factor that influenced him to agree to go ahead and join.
Yeah.
And the facts are, Kinsey, that yeah, a lot of men get killed in war, but a whole lot more don't, And so when I look back on it, some of the things in retrospect by today's standards were not all that important. But at that time, I was never doing anything that I didn't feel was important. I was given to feel that it was the most important thing I could do. And I really believe that. When I think back on it, much of it from early 42 to April 44 was a cakewalk. And then from May 44 on up to the end of the war, it was the war. I wouldn't describe that as a cakewalk. But anyway, my first couple of years in Samoa, we thought the Japanese were coming. They didn't get there, and it wasn't long until we knew they wouldn't get there once we heard about the fighting going on up at Guadalcanal. Going overseas, which was in June of 42. Claude and I were in the same unit, and another fella from California, our age, Bob Owens, we got to palling around a lot together. And when we got off the ship in Pango Pango, our company sergeant called, there were 30 of us. He called us together on the dock and he said, "You have freedom, you have liberty until 2 o'clock this afternoon. And you are going to be split up into going to one of 3 locations. The locations are Wallis Island, Guadalcanal Island, and Upolu Island." None of those meant anything to us. We had never heard of Wallis or Guadalcanal or Upolu. We thought we would go swimming, so we got our trunks and we hitchhiked west to the airstrip that was being built. No trouble getting a ride. There were trucks going back and forth all the time. So we get out there and we are at the edge of the airfield that was being built. And we put on our trunks there and we jumped in the water. And we were having fun just being in the water. And some pilots came by, second lieutenants. And we talked to them a bit and we said, "We come in on the Lurline boat this morning and we're going to one of 3 islands. We given a chance to go to Wallis Island, Guadalcanal, or Upolu. Which of those do you think would be the best place to go?" And they said, "Well, that's a no-brainer. go to Upolu. Upolu happens to be the name of the island of Western Samoa. So Western Samoa is just a little bit west of Tutuila, which is American Samoa, and the port of Pango Pango. So that afternoon we were all back together with the company sergeant, and he said, do any of you have any preference as to where you're going? So Claude Harrison and I and Bob Owens, who had gone swimming together, we said we'd like to go to the island of Upolu. And he marked off our name. He said we need 4 more for Upolu. And 4 guys raised their hand, maybe more, but he took 4, and so 7 of us were destined to go to Upolu. The others were destined to go to Wallace and Guadalcanal. So anyway, he told us to go pack our sea bags and get our rifles and everything and report back on the dock. So we did, and we get back on the dock, and there's a Higgins boat there waiting for us, so we all get ourselves and our gear aboard the Higgins boat, and we pull out into the harbor, and there's a small ship anchored there called the Kamanga, and we go aboard the Kamanga. Kamanga was an old ship, and it had been used in World War I, but anyway, it was there to haul supplies between the islands. So we go aboard the Kamanga, and we are all told that we are deck cargo. There's a deck out there with a tarpaulin over it, so we go all sit on the deck. The island, or the harbor of Tutuila, Pango Pango, is like the rest of the island. There is a lot of rain. And so we first get wet, then we pull out our, what do you call them? The
Ponchos?
ponchos. We pull out our ponchos, and we are given, we had pith helmets already, the ones with the broad beam, but we pull out our ponchos and get our rifles underneath that, and we sort of just sit there from sort of noon, no, about 2 p.m. in the afternoon, 2:30, until about 7 o'clock that evening. When we came out with Higgins' boat, we brought along 2 gunny sacks of supplies, of food. So come dusk, we opened one of the sacks, and it had sea rations in it. Sea rations were all in cans. One of the cans had a can opener, and you'd open that can, and it would have in it a disc of coffee, not to drink, but to put in your mess cup, and it would dissolve in the coffee. There would be a couple sheets of toilet paper, and a way to open up 2 other cans. One would be, 3 others: pork and beans, beef stew, and I think vegetable soup. Anyway, we'd split those among us, and we'd eat our supper. And the cans went over the side. There was no talk about environmental protection, EPA stuff, you know. Anyway, later on, we had to go to the bathroom, is a nice way of putting it. And one of the guys, the oldest among us, went to the bridge there and talked to a sailor in his, work clothes, and he said, we'd like to use your bathroom, or use your head. And the guy said, you see that bucket back there with the rope on it? And Ray Olson, who was the guy talking, said, yes. He says, that's your head. You can use your imagination on how to use it. Ray said, well, could I speak to an officer? He said, I am an officer. And as the need arose, you would take the toilet paper out of your sea ration can. You'd go back there and throw the bucket over the edge and pull it up, not too full of water, and you'd take a shit in the, pardon the language, ladies, in the bucket, and use the toilet paper the best you could, and then dump it all back overseas. It wasn't really a private little affair, but that's the way it worked. And we arrived at Upolu, as I said, we pulled out about 7, and we were eating after we got out of the harbor. We got into Upolu. I think it went very slow because we didn't get there till well after daylight the next day, and it isn't that far, so the boat didn't send any speed records. Anyway, we go ashore, and there is a corporal from the Malfanua area there to meet us, and he made sure we had our backpacks and our sleeping rolls and our rifles and everything, and he put us in form. Then he said field march, so that you don't have to stay in step and you don't have to stay in ranks, you can just walk. That's field march, forward march. So we started heading out to Malafanua, which is about 18 miles. We get about 3 miles out though, and a truck comes, and it's taking some stuff into town, but on the way back it stops, and we all get on, and it takes us out there. So we get out there, and they had already eaten dinner, but the guy, the mess sergeant, he said, stick around, I'll fix you something, and he did. So in the meantime, they had some tents for that we were to put up. So anyway, that's how we ended up at Upolu, and we were there from, we got there in June, July of 42 to April 1st, March. We moved back to Panko in April. We were there until March of 44. And then we came back to Panko for a month. Then we came back to the States for a month furlough, and then back to Camp Lejeune. And then I was assigned to the 1st Joint Assault Signal Company, which was a part of the 5th Amphibious Force. And we took our troops, we took our role aboard the El Dorado, which was Admiral Turner's, who was commander of amphibious forces of the Pacific. It was his flagship until Nagasaki, until the A-bombs were dropped. And at that time, they had a point program. If you had 50 points, you were eligible for relief. You got so many points for each service month you were in, so many points for each month overseas, so many points for each designated combat, and on. I had enough points for a couple of families to get out. Anyway, they sent me back for termination, and I felt bad about that because it had always been my hope to get to China. And some guys did get to go to China, but I came back and I got discharged. And I went to work for the railroad for several months in December, January, and February as a telegraph operator, of course. And then I started college in March. And I met your grandmother there. This would be March of 45.
What college did you go to?
Iowa State Teachers College, which happened to be in the same town where my father was then the depot agent, Cedar Falls, Iowa. It's now called University of Northern Iowa. One of the Jaguars, a center for the local Jags, graduated from UNI. Anyway, I met your mother there either late 46 or early 47. And we had coffee and we started keeping fairly serious dates. I wasn't sure about her, but I knew that if I wasn't around her, I missed her. But anyway, finally we agreed that we did love each other. In those days, it was appropriate, at least for guys of my upbringing, to ask her father's permission. Her father was a manager of the maintenance department of the Waterloo Bus Company, a larger city than I lived in. And we drove out there that night, and I got out to talk to her father, and I didn't really know what to say. And he was going from bus to bus, and me following him. And he knew I wanted to say something, I'm sure. But finally I said, Mr. May, I would like your permission to marry your daughter. And he said, well, do you love her? I said, I surely do. He says, does she love you? She says she does. He says, well, fine, you have my permission. I said, thank you, sir. And I went back out to the car and told my wife about that lengthy conversation with her father. And that's sort of how it all, I don't know, either started or ended up. I'm not sure, Kinsey. Anyway, here we are. 63 years later, come May 28th. And again, as you said earlier, this is April 20th. So 63 years, and they've been good ones. Really good.